As you heard in my intro, I'm very focused on the 8th Virginia Regiment. I'll just tell you very briefly and then dive into things here. This was a regiment that was raised on what was then the frontier, Western Virginia. You got to realize that during Revolutionary times, Virginia was Virginia and West Virginia and Kentucky and Ohio and Indiana and Illinois and Wisconsin and half of Minnesota. But most of that territory was not populated. So when I say the frontier, I really just mean the Shenandoah Valley and a little bit beyond there. I don't know how familiar you all are with the geography, but I'll show you a map before too long. Peter Muhlenberg was the colonel of the regiment. Here, by the way, is you'll see this again at the end. This is Peter Muhlenberg. He was a pastor, a soldier, and a politician. He's not one of the most famous Revolutionary War officers. He's not usually thought of as a founding father, but he did contribute something very important to the founding of our country. And that is what I'm going to talk about. And I mean religious freedom. He didn't write the First Amendment, but his actions inspired the freedoms that we have. Now, to understand him, I'm going to go way back to, well, now it's not wanting to. All right, so I'm going to go way back to in European history for a second, to the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War, as most of you probably know, was a religious war between Catholics and Protestants. It was exceptionally brutal. I believe I read somewhere that 1/3 of the population of the countries involved was killed during the course of the war. This is King Gustav Adolf of Sweden. I'm Swedish, so he's Gustav den Andre Adolf, or Gustav Adolf II. He was the champion of Protestantism and the King of Sweden. He had an empire. This is the Swedish Empire. It was all of Sweden, all of Finland, and important cities around the Baltic Sea. Sweden also had a colony in North America known as New Sweden. Most people don't know this. It was where the state of Delaware is, and southeastern Pennsylvania and southern New Jersey. This house you're looking at is the oldest house in Pennsylvania. It was built in New Sweden in 1640. It's in Drexel Hill, Pennsylvania. And it was built 100 years before Peter Muhlenberg was born. So that just gives you some context. The New Sweden colony was taken over by the Dutch, and then the Dutch were taken over by the English, but the Swedish Lutheran Church survived. This is a Swedish Lutheran church built about 1699 in Philadelphia. The church survived, and it was supported by the King of Sweden right up through the Revolution. So the Swedish Lutheran Church was a going concern for quite a while. Then, when the English took over, they eventually deeded the land to William Penn, King Charles. This is William Penn as a young man. He founded the colony of Pennsylvania. He was a Quaker, very high-minded, believed in tolerance and religious liberty. He invited refugees from what was still war-torn Germany to come to America to settle his colony. He needed people. And they wanted a place to go and be free. So they came. Over time, the growing German population breeded some resistance. Immigration has always been a controversial issue. Here, for example, is a quote from Benjamin Franklin complaining about all these Germans coming from the Palatine region of Germany. I'll just read it out loud. Why should the Palatine or German Boers be suffered to swarm into our settlement and by herding together establish their language and manners to the exclusion of ours? Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our anglicizing, or he says anglicifying them? and will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion. That's Benjamin Franklin in 1751. So you can see that there was controversy associated with these guys. Now, the guy on the left, his name is Conrad Weiser. He was a German refugee. He came in 1710. He was Peter Muhlenberg's grandfather. He grew up to be a very important explorer and Indian agent and Indian negotiator. Conrad Weiser's son-in-law is Henry Muhlenberg, or Heinrich Muhlenberg. He was sent here as a missionary from Germany in 1745 as a single man. His job was to organize the Lutheran Church in America. As I told you, there had been Lutherans here since 1638, but they didn't have any clergy or organization. And most Lutherans in America were now German. So Henry was sent by the German Lutheran Church to come and sort of organize the Lutheran Church. And when he came here, he got married to Conrad's daughter. This is his church in a little town called Trapp, Pennsylvania. Henry had 3 sons. All 3 of them, he wanted them to be pastors. He sent all 3 of them back to Germany. 2 of them to seminary, and 1 was apprenticed as to a shopkeeper. He was going to learn to be a businessman. That one was Peter, the future general. Peter soon figured out that he wasn't really learning anything other than to run the proverbial cash register. So he ran away and joined the army. Now, if you know your history, you'll know that the King of England at that time was German, right? The House of Hanover. And so German regiments would go into certain parts of Germany to recruit. Or English regiments would go into certain parts of Germany to recruit. So it was actually an English regiment that was recruiting for service in America that Peter joined. And that was his way of getting home. So he came home that way, and somewhat chastened, he behaved a little bit better and learned to be a pastor under the tutelage of his father. So now, if you go south a little bit, this is Sir William Barkley, the most influential of all of Virginia's colonial governors. Very different from William Penn, earlier than William Penn. He was governor from 1642, and then a little interregnum when Parliament controlled government in England, and then he was governor again until 1677. He, more than anyone else, designed the system of government in Virginia. He was very much an Anglican, very intolerant of minority or dissenting religions. He enacted laws to ban pastors from any denomination other than the Church of England from preaching in Virginia. And that's the way Virginia was. It had an official state church. You were not allowed to have any other kind of church. Your taxes went to support the church. When you were born or died, it was the church that made record of it. Your marriage was had to be recorded in the English church. And if your marriage was performed by anybody else, it might not have been legal, right? So that's what Virginia was like in the colonial era. This gentleman, you can tell what his heritage is, Scottish. This is John Murray, the 4th Earl of Dunmore. He is the last governor of Virginia. He was ousted during the Revolution. Back in those times, new counties were often named after the incumbent governor. And if you see here where it says Dunmore County, that was created in 1772 and named after the governor. Remember, you have to have an English church at this time, 1772. But that region, which is on the far side of the Blue Ridge Mountains, was largely populated by German and Scotch-Irish immigrants who had come via Pennsylvania on this road. So they needed a pastor who could preach to Germans, but he had to be Anglican. So this is the kind of mess they would get in back then. So what they did is they recruited Peter Muhlenberg to come down from Pennsylvania. They sent him to England so he could be ordained by the Bishop of London. And then he came back so that he could be the rector of this little country parish. That's the rigmarole he had to go through in order to preach at this little town of Woodstock in the Shenandoah Valley. But once he had done that, this is the earliest known picture of him. Once he had done that, he was a pillar of the community out on the frontier. And when the revolution came, he was a revolutionary leader. He was elected to the Revolutionary Convention. This was sort of the temporary government, revolutionary government of Virginia before they had a new constitution. He was present at the Third Virginia Convention when Patrick Henry, that's who you're looking at here, gave his famous speech, "Give me liberty or give me death." Muhlenberg was evidently quite inspired by that and became a real patriot. So talking some more about religious liberty here, this is a really important early document. So this is something written by Patrick Henry. When the war started, Baptists who had not been treated well at all in colonial Virginia, their preachers were not only illegal, they would get sometimes beat up and put in jail. They were willing to fight, but they didn't want to have to listen to Anglican chaplains. So they sent a petition to the government and said, hey, we're willing to fight, but we want to have our own chaplains. So I won't read this to you, but this is a resolution written by Patrick Henry to allow the Baptists to have their own chaplains and to excuse them from having to attend normal chapel. So this is it doesn't sound like a big deal to us, but back then this was a big deal, right? So this is 1775, I believe. Muhlenberg did not, that's Peter Muhlenberg's signature there. So he was at the Third Virginia Convention. And then at the Fourth Virginia Convention, they authorized the formation of a bunch of new regiments. And then at the Fifth Virginia Convention, he attended and he came home with a commission. So he was the colonel of the new regiment, and then Abraham Bowman there and Peter Helfenstein were the lieutenant colonel and the major. I will not get into details on these guys because that's not our point today. But he was commissioned a colonel. He went back home. They recruited, and he gave this famous sermon that you might have heard of. So he got into his pulpit, and he read from Ecclesiastes. If you don't know your Bible, you probably remember the song by the Byrds, "To everything there's a season," right? And at the end of that passage there's a time for peace and a time for war. And he said, it's time for war, and they headed off to war. Now, this is often remembered as a recruiting sermon, and at which every man in the congregation stood up and enlisted instantly. That's not actually what happened. It's also remembered that he was wearing his black preacher's cloak over his Continental Army uniform. And then at the dramatic moment, he took off his cloak to reveal his uniform. Also not the way it happened. Everybody knew that he was an officer. He wasn't a Continental officer yet because the Virginia line hadn't been taken into the Continental Army yet. He was a Virginia officer. But the rest of the story is true. And a very famous one. This is the way his great nephew wrote the story. It's very dramatic. For the sake of time, I won't read it to you, but the story has been exaggerated. This is a statue in the U.S. Capitol of Peter Muhlenberg taking off his cloak, right? And this goes along with the notion that he was hiding his uniform underneath. I think he wore the cloak just out of propriety. He was in the pulpit giving a sermon. But this is a statue of him taking off his preacher's cloak. It's in the U.S. Capitol. You see the image in lots of other places here. Here's a painting from the 1920s. Again, a Continental uniform, which he did not actually have on because he didn't own one, taking off his cloak. Here's a statue in Woodstock, Virginia, pretty much at the spot where he gave the sermon. This is the town seal for Woodstock with a picture of him taking off his cloak. Here's a stained glass window in Harrisonburg, Virginia. You can see him there giving his sermon, holding a sword. So it's a very well-known story. This is more likely what he was actually wearing, by the way. A little bit different. Here's a contemporary picture of a Virginia rifleman. So he went back he took his regiment to Williamsburg, and then they were sent with General Charles Lee down to South Carolina. They were at the Battle of Sullivan's Island, also known as the Battle of Fort Moultrie. Within a couple of weeks of their departure, Virginia voted to direct their representatives to the Continental Congress to offer a motion to declare independence. In doing so, Virginia declared its own independence, and they then proceeded to draft a new constitution for Virginia, including a Charter of Liberties. And this is section 16, that religion or the duty which we owe to our Creator and the manner of discharging it can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. And therefore, all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience, and that it is the mutual duty of all to practice Christian forbearance, love, and charity towards each other. So this Virginia Declaration of Rights is the foundation for the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Bill of Rights. In fact, James Madison helped write both of them. If you read the whole Virginia Declaration of Rights, a lot of the language will sound very familiar to you. Soon after that, there was a petition. It's called the 10,000 Signature Petition. In colonial Virginia, there was this practice of sending petitions to the government. It was just like writing a letter to your congressman, except you would get all your neighbors to sign it. Remember, this is before, the postal service, before railroads. It was very hard to communicate. So if people in a neighborhood had a problem, they would just write to the to the colonial legislature, later the state legislature, and send a petition. And you get as many people to sign it as possible. And then hopefully the assembly would act on it. So this is a practice that dates all the way back to the Magna Carta. And it only petered out with the advent of the railroad. The 10,000 name petition was led, I think, by Baptists, and they wanted freedom of religion in Virginia. You don't hear much about the 10,000 name petition, but it was sent in to the legislature in 1776. It had obviously more than 10,000 signatures. It was bound and had wax seals. And Virginia didn't disestablish the Church of England, but it did stop mandating that people tithe to it, which is a big deal after 180 years of being an English colony. That's how old Virginia is. And then after that, Virginia really led the way to religious freedom. So now Muhlenberg goes south with General Lee. He's at the Battle of Sullivan's Island. They come back. He gets promoted, becomes a brigadier general. He's at the Battle of Brandywine. This is an image of the Battle of Brandywine. That's Lord Cornwallis there scowling on the horse. This was painted by a guy named Adrian Martinez. He was at Germantown. He was at Valley Forge. He was at Monmouth. He was with Washington up around New York. He avoided getting captured at Charleston in 1780 when most of the Virginia line was captured. And then in 1781, he was sent down to lead the remnants of the army and new militia in Virginia. You don't hear much about it, but the Battle of Petersburg was a big success for him. And then he was at Yorktown. This is the Battle of Yorktown. He's there way over on the right. That's zoomed in. You see that guy with the big nose? That's Peter Muhlenberg. This is zoomed in so much, it looks a little bit blurry, but the second guy from the right, the guy on the far right is Henry Knox. So that's the closest thing you'll get to a photographic image. Is very accurate of Peter Muhlenberg. This is a portrait of him that was painted a little while later. He still has kind of the big nose, but it's not quite as prominent in this picture. He was offered his old job back as the pastor in Woodstock, but he said it would never do to mount the pastor after the soldier. So it's an equestrian image. So he never returned to preaching. And in fact, he moved back to Pennsylvania, where he was a hero, especially to the Germans. Remember the Germans, if you remember the Franklin quote, they were sort of like second-class citizens in some way. And here is a guy who was a major general. That was a brevet rank at the end of the war, but he was a major general in the Continental Army. So many years later, 1910, the German-American community commissioned this statue. It was outside City Hall in Philadelphia for a long time, and now it's by the Art Museum in Philadelphia. But Peter Muhlenberg was a big deal. Here's an image of his famous sermon down below. He was a big deal for Germans all over America. Now, here's James Madison. So he co-wrote the Virginia Charter of Liberties. After the war in 1784, Patrick Henry, who had written that resolution to allow the Baptists to have their own chaplains, he introduced a bill in Virginia to raise a new tax to support clergy. Okay, that seems like an odd thing for us today, but it wasn't just going to be Anglican church clergy, it was going to be any Christian clergy. So this was like a big liberal thing. He was opening it up to everybody. The state had always supported, or the colony had always supported Anglican clergy. Now we're going to support everybody. But some people didn't like that, including James Madison, who said, no, you know, the government shouldn't be involved in the church at all. And he had pretty strong views about it. But he kept them to himself. So he was talked into writing a very famous petition, just like the other petition, that is known as the Memorial and Remonstrance, which is really just a fancy word for a petition. But he wrote it anonymously. He didn't want anybody to know he wrote it. And that might be because he had other fish he wanted to fry and didn't want to get caught into this too much, or because it was controversial and he just wanted to kind of keep his name out of it. But it's a very important document in American history. It was circulated very widely. He got 1,500 signatures on it. There were other petitions making the same argument, but nowhere nearly as eloquently written. And there were a total of, many thousands of people who wrote opposing Patrick Henry's tax proposal. And in fact, it was defeated. Madison said the bill implies either that the civil magistrate is a competent judge of a religious truth, or that he may employ religion as an engine of civil policy. The first is an arrogant pretension falsified by the contradictory opinions of rulers of all ages and throughout the world. The second is an unhallowed perversion of the means of salvation. Government should butt out. That's what that means. So the tax was in fact defeated. And then rewinding the clock back to 1777, Thomas Jefferson here drafted a bill to disestablish the Church of England in Virginia. It wasn't acted on until 1786. So in 1786, the Church of England was disestablished in Virginia. The Church of England is now the Episcopal Church, by the way. Interesting sidebar, Massachusetts didn't disestablish their state church until 1833. That was the Congregational Church, now the United Church of Christ. So Peter Muhlenberg was a hero, not just for Germans, but also for Lutherans. This is a small memorial to him in Washington, D.C. It was going to be across the street from a Lutheran cathedral but the Great Depression put the kibosh on the cathedral. The memorial was built eventually with private money. Then Peter Muhlenberg was elected to Congress from Pennsylvania. He was in the first, third, and fifth Congresses. So he voted on the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment, of which says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So almost all of this is taken from the Virginia Charter of Liberties. It's written by James Madison, who helped George Mason write the Virginia Charter of Liberties. The same James Madison who wrote the Memorial and Remonstrance. And the last bit here about petitioning the government for redress of grievances, by the way, when we look at that today, we think about lobbying. What that's really referring to is that old process that dates back to the Magna Carta, where you get all your neighbors to sign a petition. And in the old days, if the government didn't like your petition, you could get, punished. So it wasn't until 1689 that it was illegal to punish people for petitioning the government. And the founders wanted to make sure that we had that same privilege here. But the key thing here for our purposes today is no law respecting the establishment of religion. So we're not going to have a state church, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So that's the history of all of that. Here is Peter Muhlenberg's grave. He's buried at his father's church in Trapp, Pennsylvania. He was, after his 3 terms in the House of Representatives, and I should tell you, by the way, he was also the de facto governor of Pennsylvania before that. He was elected to the US Senate, but only served very briefly because his buddy, Thomas Jefferson, got elected president. If you know your history well, you'll know that the election of 1800 was very controversial. So it was Federalists versus Jeffersonian Republicans. And John Adams was not eager to relinquish power. And there was a lot of name calling. It was just as nasty as the election we just had in America, worse in some ways. But when Adams lost, he left office peacefully, and his arch enemy, Thomas Jefferson, became president. And that proved to the world that a peaceable transfer of power after a democratic process was possible. It never happened before. It also meant that all the plum patronage jobs went to Jefferson's buddies, and Peter Muhlenberg got one. He was the tariff collector for imported goods in Philadelphia. And then he passed away in 1807. If you can't read it, it says below his name, he was brave in the field, faithful in the cabinet. That's a reference to his state services as sort of vice governor. Honorable in his transactions, a sincere friend, and an honest man. So, we take liberty and equality for granted today. And the founders, they grew up familiar with the concept of the rights of Englishmen, but those rights were pretty strictly circumscribed, right? You were free to be an Anglican, right, in Virginia, right? William Penn, who I mentioned briefly, he went to jail for being a Quaker, and at his trial, the judge told the jury how to vote, right? The rights that we have are really a pretty recent vintage, including our religious freedoms. The Revolution forced Americans to think hard about what freedom really meant. And sometimes it was uncomfortable, right? I mean, a lot of the founders owned slaves, but but especially after the Revolution, half of the colonies banned slavery. The South didn't do it, but some southern states tried, and many individuals in Virginia freed their slaves just voluntarily. You don't hear much about that today. Ben Franklin, who had all that nasty stuff to say about Germans back in 1751, under Pennsylvania's revolutionary constitution, there was no governor. There was what you call a plural executive. It was sort of a council. Franklin was the president of the Executive Council of Pennsylvania, and Muhlenberg was the vice president. So one of those Germans that Franklin had so much nasty stuff to say about, however many years before, 30 years earlier. And Franklin was old and not well. So Peter Muhlenberg, he was like the lieutenant governor. He signed all the documents and did all the work. So he was the de facto governor. That would have been unheard of just 50 years earlier. For one of these German immigrants to actually be running things in Pennsylvania was, nobody would have fathomed that. And Muhlenberg, he really bridged worlds, right? The colonies didn't get along, but he bridged Pennsylvania and the span between Virginia and Pennsylvania, who had actually been fighting over territorial stuff around Pittsburgh. He bridged Anglicanism and Lutheranism. He bridged the frontier and the settled parts of Virginia. And that's, it's an example of what happened throughout the United States. Some of you will know that when the Revolution first started and the first Southern troops showed up around Boston, fistfights broke out between the Bostonians and the Virginians. So they hated each other. It was very different cultures. And it was the war and service in the Continental Army that really first unified the country. And Peter Muhlenberg was a big part of that. So that is here's a book. If you want to read more about Peter Muhlenberg, here's a new book by my friend Mike Cecere. It's not too long. It's about 200 pages. It's worth a read. And if you want to read more of my stuff, here's where you should go. And I am done. Thank you, gentlemen.